They went looking for the python and found it inside something smaller. The transmitter told them where to go. A surgeon at Zoo Miami had sewn a small radio tag into the body of a young female python months earlier, and for weeks the signal had moved through the Picayune Strand exactly the way a python moves, slow and low and deliberate through the wet grass. Then the team went out to put hands on her, followed the tag to a patch of ground, parted the brush, and there was no python there at all. There was a cottonmouth, a native water moccasin, thick through the middle, its belly swollen, and the signal they had been chasing was coming from inside it. They took the animal in. The X-ray at the hospital showed the rest of the story in a single grey image. The python swallowed whole, its spine folded into a tight curve that traced the shape of the snake wrapped around it, and the transmitter riding in the cottonmouth's gut like a swallowed coin. For 20 years, the rule had held in this part of Florida. Nothing native could kill one of these, and something just had, and by everything the science had written down for 2 decades, it should not have been able to. That cottonmouth was not a fluke. It was a signal in its own right, the first clear ping of something much larger moving through the record. Because over the last few years, out in the wettest and least watched country in the state, the native animals of the Florida wilderness have started doing the one thing every model said they would never learn to do. They have started killing the snake that was killing everything else. The person who first notices a thing like that is usually not the one who publishes it. It is the one who takes the calls. Every agency that manages this country keeps some version of the same desk. The phone rings, and on the other end is a hunter, a homeowner, an airboat guide, a retiree who walks the same levee every morning, and they have seen something. A snake longer than their truck bed stretched across a service road at dawn, a tail disappearing into a culvert, a shed skin the width of a dinner plate hanging in the sore grass. The ranger who fields those calls writes each one down, logs the location, and over enough years builds something no single study can build. A feel for what the country is doing. And for most of 2 decades, what the country was doing was going quiet. The reports change over the years in a way you can almost read like tree rings. Early on, in the 1990s and the first years after 2000, the calls are scattered and strange. A big exotic snake, where no big exotic snake should be. A curiosity, a one-off. Then they thicken. More snakes, bigger snakes in more places, and underneath them a second pattern that takes longer to name. The other calls stop coming. The ordinary ones. Nobody phones a ranger station to report that they did not see a raccoon. But the person who has driven the same road for 30 years knows when the eyeshine goes out of the ditches, and eventually some of them call about that too. And the ranger writes it down, and the pile grows, and it all points one direction. Down. To understand why that quiet was so frightening, you have to know what the Burmese python became down here, and what it was never supposed to be. It is not from Florida. It is not from anywhere near Florida. It belongs to the forests and river margins of Southeast Asia, thousands of miles away, and it arrived in South Florida the way most slow disasters arrive, quietly, in a box, as somebody's pet. Through the 1970s and 80s and 90s, they came in by the tens of thousands for the exotic animal trade. The US Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that roughly 180,000 Burmese pythons were imported into the country between 1975 and 2018. Some escaped. Some were released by owners who watched a cute hatchling become a creature longer than their living room and decided the swamp could have it. And when Hurricane Andrew tore across South Florida in 1992, biologists believe it may have finished the job, breaking open enclosures and breeding facilities and spilling snakes into a landscape that had never seen anything like them. They found the country agreeable, warm, wet, endless, and full of food that had no idea what they were. A Burmese python can pass 19 feet in length. The heaviest one ever pulled out of Florida weighed 215 pounds and stretched nearly 18 feet, hauled out of the Picayune Strand by a team that had to wrestle it for 20 minutes just to control its head. A single female can lay a clutch of dozens of eggs, with an average around 43 and records running past 90. They can live more than 20 years, and they eat almost anything with a pulse. In 2024, biologists walked up on a 115-pound python in the act of swallowing a 77-pound deer, a meal that came to roughly 2/3 of the snake's own body weight. Hard proof that these animals were now taking prey large enough that almost nothing else in the marsh would attempt it. They spread across more than 1,000 square miles of South Florida, and the marsh they took went silent in a way that shows up in cold numbers. A study published in 2012 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences documented what had happened in the heart of the python's range. Raccoon sightings had fallen by more than 99%, opossums by nearly 99%, bobcats by close to 88%, white-tailed deer by 94%. Marsh rabbits and foxes had simply stopped turning up in the surveys at all, a clean collapse to zero. The python did not just move in, it emptied the room. There are people who drove those park roads at night for decades, rangers and biologists who used to count eyeshine in their headlights, raccoons and rabbits and opossums scattered through the dark, the ordinary reassuring traffic of a living swamp. They will tell you the roads went quiet, not quieter, quiet. You can drive long stretches of that country at night now and see almost nothing warm-blooded at all. And for years, almost no one tied that emptiness to the snake, because the snake is nearly impossible to see. A python the length of a car can lie a few feet off a trail, and you will walk past it and never know it watched you go. Most of the animals it ate without a single witness. The collapse was total, and it was invisible, and that combination is the entire reason it took so long for anyone to grasp the size of what was moving through the grass. Here is the part that made it feel less like an animal and more like a law of physics. In its native range, the Burmese python has predators, rivals, parasites, disease, the full weight of a world that grew up alongside it and learned to push back. In Florida, it had none of that. The prey here had never met it, and animals that have never met a predator do not fear it correctly. There was no instinct to draw on, no inherited memory of a snake that big. The python walked into the top of the food web and closed the door behind it. There is a photograph from 2009 of researchers holding open a python 15 feet long and 162 pounds. They had cut it apart to see what was inside. Inside was a 6-foot American alligator, whole. The snake had eaten the one animal everyone assumed sat at the very top of this ecosystem, and it had done it without much apparent trouble at all. So the science settled into a hard and unhappy consensus, and it held for the better part of 20 years. Nothing native could reliably kill an adult Burmese python. The only creature with even a theoretical chance was the American alligator, and the gator was, at best, an even match. Frank Mazzotti, one of the University of Florida scientists who has spent his career on this problem, said it about as plainly as it can be said. The hope that alligators could control the pythons was gone. Nothing in this country, he said, was safe from this snake. That was the world the ranger at the desk was living in. A snake with no enemies, laying 100 eggs a season, spreading across an ecosystem the size of a small country, and not one native animal that could be counted on to do a thing about it. And then, slowly, the way the pythons themselves had arrived, the settled answer began to crack. It started with the one predator everyone had already half expected. In the Shark Valley stretch of the park, more than once now, people on the tram loop and on bicycles have come around a bend and found an alligator with a dead python clamped in its jaws, swimming off with it, chewing it down over days. A volunteer has filmed it happening more than once. In one of those encounters, she watched a single gator hold on to its python carcass for 3 days straight, guarding a meal that was already going soft in the heat. It is a real thing, and it matters. The American alligator is one of the only native animals that can take a full-grown python and win. But it did not so much break the old rule as prove it. Everyone already knew the gator could do this, and everyone already knew it cut both ways. Biologists had watched the two apex reptiles collide again and again in the water, and it went in both directions. Sometimes the alligator won. Sometimes the python swallowed the alligator whole, the way it had in that 2009 case. In one grim encounter in 2015, a 13-foot python tried to swallow a 6-foot gator, and the whole thing ruptured, killing them both, and scientists found the remains days later. There are something like 1.3 million alligators in Florida, and even that number, even that animal, had not tipped the balance in 20 years. The alligator was the ceiling, the single exception, the one heavyweight in a ring where the python otherwise had no opponent at all. If the gator had been the whole story, the story would have stayed exactly where it was. An even draw between the two giants, and every smaller animal in the marsh left out of the fight entirely. Every smaller animal was not left out of it. That was the thing nobody saw coming, and it is where the record the ranger keeps starts to disagree with the science the ranger was handed. Start with the cat. In June of 2021, in Big Cypress National Preserve, researchers with the United States Geological Survey set up a motion-triggered camera on the nest of a large female python, a snake weighing about 120 pounds, curled over her clutch of eggs. They wanted to learn how pythons nest because almost nobody knew. Most nests are destroyed the moment they are found, but the ecology team made the case to leave this one alone and watch it. The camera did not catch the python doing much of anything. She moved too slowly and steadily to trigger it. What the camera caught instead, a single day after it went up, was a bobcat. A 20-pound bobcat, a house cat with wild edges, found the nest while the mother was briefly away and went to work. In the researchers' own careful language, it began consuming, trampling, caching, and uncovering the eggs. It ate what it wanted and buried the rest to come back for later. It returned 3 times that first night alone, and when the enormous female came back to defend her nest, the bobcat did not run. It stood its ground and swiped at a snake many times its size. Over the weeks that followed, through June and into August, the camera kept catching it, coming back to dig at the eggs it had hidden. It was the first time any animal in Florida had ever been documented preying on python eggs, and the first description anyone had of a native animal standing and fighting at a python nest. The study went into the journal Ecology and Evolution. Andrea Curillo, the USGS ecologist who led the work, put it in words that carried more weight than they seemed to. They had not seen this kind of resilience in the ecosystem against an invasive apex predator. They had heard of bobcats and pythons crossing paths. Nothing like this. And it was not the bobcat's first move against this snake. Researchers had already found a python carcass with claw marks raked down its body, matched to a bobcat. Another female python had turned up with a bite wound and scratches. There was even an earlier record from 2021 of a bobcat killing a 10-foot male python outright, a 10-foot snake killed by an animal that weighs what a car tire weighs. There is a detail that makes the whole thing land harder. The bobcat is one of the animals the python nearly erased. In the heart of python country, the bobcat population had crashed by close to 90%. The same collapse that took the raccoons and the rabbits and the opossums. So the animal robbing that python nest was not just any native. It belonged to the exact species the snake had spent 20 years eating out of the marsh. One of the survivors was standing in a python's nest, tearing open its eggs. Here is the quiet reason it took 2 decades to see any of this. Nobody was watching the nest. Why would they? The whole assumption was that a python nest in this country was the safest address in the ecosystem. A fortress guarded by an animal nothing could challenge. The one place no one thought to point a camera was the one place the fightback was already happening. Then there was the snake that opened this whole account. The cottonmouth in the Picayune Strand, with a tracked python folded up inside it. To understand how that transmitter got where it got, you have to know how these pythons are followed at all. Biologists in South Florida run what they call a scout snake program. They catch a python, usually a male, and surgeons implant a small radio transmitter in its body, and then they let it go. In breeding season, the male goes searching for females, and the signal leads the team to females and to nests they could never otherwise find in a wilderness this size. It is patient, invasive, intimate work. The people who do it come to know individual snakes by their signals the way you might know a voice through a wall. In August of 2020, in the Picayune Strand State Forest near Naples, one of those tracked pythons was a young female, its transmitter sewn in months earlier. For weeks, the signal moved through the strand as it should. Then the team followed the tag to the ground and found the cottonmouth instead, swollen, the signal coming from inside it. About a week later, the native snake passed the transmitter and went on with its life. And the tag was recovered from the ground, still faithfully sending, now with nothing left to find. It happened again. In May of 2021, in Big Cypress, another tracked python led its trackers to another cottonmouth, and the radiograph at Zoo Miami showed the same thing, the skull and spine of a juvenile python. This one swallowed tail first. 2 separate cases, 2 locations, 2 native pit vipers doing what the models said could not be done at any meaningful rate. Ron McGill, the zoo's communications director, confirmed the details. The cottonmouth is a generalist, a known snake eater that will take dozens of different species. Now the list had a new entry on it, and the record kept climbing into stranger territory. The eastern indigo snake is the longest native snake on the continent, a glossy blue-black animal that can pass 8 feet, and it is federally protected. A threatened species clinging on in the same shrinking wild the python is overrunning. It earns that length by hunting other snakes, which is the one skill that now makes it useful against an invader far larger than anything it evolved to swallow. It takes the pythons young before they grow into the thing nothing can handle. This matters more than it might sound, because the hatchling is the python's one soft moment. In late summer, the young snakes leave the nest and disperse on their own, often traveling along waterways and through wetland edges to find territory. And for those first weeks and months, they are small, inexperienced, and roughly the size of the native predators around them, rather than towering over everything. If the invasion has a throat to be caught by, it is here, in the young, before they grow into the thing nothing can handle. Biologists with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida began radio tracking python hatchlings to learn how many survived those first months. Some of those hatchlings went silent. When the team followed the signals, they were led more than once to the predators that had eaten them. And among those predators was an endangered eastern indigo snake. Sit with that. An animal we are spending enormous effort to save from extinction, eating the animal that is helping drive that extinction. Ian Bartoszek, the biologist who oversees that Python program, called those the wins for the home team. The moments when you get to watch the country fight its own battle. Then there is the king snake. The Florida king snake, another native, was documented consuming a juvenile python as well. Written up in 2023, one more link in a chain that would not stop lengthening. Snake after snake after snake, each one adding itself to a list that for 20 years had been empty. There is one more predator, and it comes with a question mark, because the science is honest about what it does not yet know. A Florida black bear was documented attacking an adult python, not eating it, not killing it. The snake survived. The bear sits in the literature as a possible predator, a maybe, a several hundred-pound animal that took a swing at the invader and left it wounded but alive. It is a small piece of the picture, but it points the same way everything else does. The big natives are starting to treat this snake as prey, or at least as an enemy, instead of gliding past it as if it were part of the furniture. And then the fightback left the ground entirely. In May of 2023, in the Francis S. Taylor Wildlife Management Area in Broward County, University of Florida researchers were tracking a tagged female python to her nest, hidden under a thick mat of grass. When they came back about a month later, they found vultures on it, at least 4 of them, tearing into the eggs. When the team examined the nest, at least 17 eggs had been punctured, their contents gone or exposed, 3 of them dragged out entirely and left as shell fragments. The mother python was in the shallow water about 40 feet away, and there was no sign anything else had come near. The study describing it was published in February of 2026 in the journal Reptiles and Amphibians. It was the first time in Florida that any bird had ever been recorded preying on a python nest. The birds lifted off before the researchers could get close enough to name the species for certain, though both black vultures and turkey vultures work that marsh. Either one had done something no bird in Florida had been recorded doing. They had found a clutch of eggs buried under grass thick enough to hide it from every set of eyes in the country, and they had found it the way vultures find everything, by smell on the wind from above. Think about what that means. Laid end to end, a cat on the ground, a snake in the water, a bird from the air, the alligator, the cottonmouth, the indigo, the king snake, the bear, the vultures. Melissa Miller, the University of Florida scientist behind the vulture study, put it exactly. The observations keep adding to a growing body of evidence that native wildlife is eating invasive pythons at every stage of their life. The eggs, the hatchlings, the juveniles, and when the animal is big enough, the adults. That is the answer to the question in the title. That is what is hunting pythons in Florida. It is not a removal program, and it is not a poison, and it is not us out there with our contests and our transmitters. It is the place itself, remembering how to defend itself, one animal at a time. So the mystery has an answer, and the answer, the way the best ones do, opens straight into a harder question. Is it enough? Here the story stops being comfortable, and the scientists are the first to say so. There are at least 3 ways to read what is happening, and none of them lets you rest. The first reading is the hopeful one. The country is learning. This is a real rebalancing, a native community that had no idea what to do with this animal, slowly folding it into the food web, hitting it at every vulnerable stage. Eggs raided in the nest, hatchlings picked off in their first weeks, juveniles swallowed by cottonmouths and indigos and king snakes, adults dragged down by gators. If that is what this is, then given enough time, the invasion finds a natural break. The way some invasions eventually do, and the marsh writes its own slow correction. That is the version that feels like the home team scoring. But look closer and the second reading pushes back. Almost everything you just heard happened to a python that was small, or an egg that had not hatched, or a nest with the mother briefly away. The cottonmouth ate a snake barely longer than itself. The bobcat robbed a clutch. The vultures took eggs. The giants, the 15-footers moving through the sawgrass, the females laying 100 eggs a season, those remain almost entirely untouched by anything but the occasional alligator. The fightback is real, and it is aimed mostly at the young. The snake at the top is still the snake at the top. And the third reading is the coldest, and it is about arithmetic. One female python lays dozens of eggs a year and can live more than 20 years. On the other side of that ledger is a war people have thrown everything at, and it is worth being specific about how much everything has been. There are annual removal contests where hundreds of hunters comb the marsh over 10 days for cash prizes. There are paid contractors who work the levee roads at night for the state. The public has been urged to catch and kill the snakes on site on most public land, no permit required, and officials have even floated eating them, marketing the meat as the chicken of the glades. It became illegal to own a Burmese python in Florida in 2021, illegal to buy or sell one back in 2010. Every legal lever that could be pulled has been pulled. The results sound enormous until you set them against the country. More than 17,000 pythons have been taken out of Florida since 2000. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida alone has removed more than 20 tons of python since 2013 and prevented more than 20,000 eggs from ever hatching. And their own monitoring shows a hopeful sign. The scout snakes increasingly struggle to find mates, and the females they do find are smaller. That is real pressure in one place, but they did it out of an area of a few hundred square miles, a sliver of an ecosystem that runs to some 7,000 or 8,000. The population, by every honest estimate, is still enormous. The rough figures run from tens of thousands into the low hundreds of thousands, uncounted, because the animal is nearly impossible to survey in country this large and this wet. And it is spreading. It is now established well up both coasts, with a brand new satellite population confirmed far up the Gulf side, and sightings pushing toward Lake Okeechobee, more than 100 miles from where it started, set a handful of documented predation events against a snake that breeds like that across a wilderness that large, and the math turns brutal. The native animals may be learning at the speed of nature. The python may be multiplying at the speed of an invasion. Those are not the same speed. And there is one more thing the python left in this marsh that complicates even the hopeful reading. It did not arrive alone. It carried a parasite, a lungworm from its native range, and that parasite has now jumped out of the pythons and into Florida's native snakes. Researchers at the University of Florida have tracked it, spreading through the very animals that share this ground, and it has been linked to the death of an eastern indigo snake, the same threatened species we just watched hunting python hatchlings. So the animal fighting back may be carrying in its own lungs a piece of the invasion it is fighting. The snake that emptied the marsh of mammals also seeded it with something that can hollow out the survivors from the inside. However you choose to read the fightback, that shadow sits across all of it, and the scientists will not tell you which reading is right because they do not know. That is the part that should stay with you. They cannot yet say how often any of this happens. A cottonmouth eating a python was documented because that python happened to have a transmitter in it. The vultures were seen because the mother happened to be tagged and the nest happened to be found. These are not measured rates. They are lucky glimpses caught by cameras and radio signals that were pointed at the pythons for entirely other reasons. Nobody can tell you whether 1,000 cottonmouths are doing this across the marsh right now, or whether you have just heard about the only one that ever will. The people doing the work have said it outright. They still do not know how many python eggs survive, how many hatchlings live to a year, what the real survival rate is at any stage, because the entire machine down here is built to remove these snakes, not to study them. You cannot easily measure the life of a thing you are trying to erase. So the honest state of it is this: something is killing pythons in Florida that, by every rule we wrote for the last 20 years, should not have been able to. Native animals, from a 20-pound cat to a bird that eats the dead, have started turning on the snake that emptied their world. It is happening at every level, on the ground, and in the water, and in the air. And no one can yet tell you whether it is the beginning of the end for the python, or just the sound of a wounded country doing what little it can, too slowly, against something that may simply be too large to stop. Which brings the ranger back to the desk, and the phone, and the record. The calls still come in: a tail in a culvert, a shed skin in the sawgrass, a snake across a service road at dawn. Each one gets written down, logged, added to a pile that for 20 years told one long story of a country going silent. But lately, mixed in with the sightings, there is a different kind of report. A gator on the tram loop, with a python in its jaws, a nest torn open with the mother still nearby and no explanation, a dead python on a levee with claw marks down its side. The record is starting to say something it never said before. The bobcat is still out there in Big Cypress, coming back to a cracked nest it buried for later. The cottonmouth is still in the Picayune Strand, still taking the young ones as they leave the egg. The vultures still ride the heat above the Francis Taylor Marsh, reading the grass for a smell they have only lately learned to want. None of them read the studies. None of them knew the rule that said they could not do this. They were here before the canals, before the levees, before the first python was ever tipped out of a box into the sawgrass. They did not leave. They learned. Whether they learned fast enough, nobody alive can tell you. Somewhere out in that vast, wet, dark green, a female python is coiled over 100 eggs in a nest no one will ever find. And somewhere close to her, low in the grass or high on a thermal, something native is moving through the heat, patient, unbothered, carrying no transmitter and keeping no record, learning her scent. It has been in this marsh a very long time. It is in no particular hurry, and it is only now beginning to remember what it was always able to do.